Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story. This one makes its actual first existence not in this volume I am showing here, but in a journal that is quite rare. I don't have a copy, and probably very, very few people would, even among the serious Asimov collectors, namely the Graduate Journal of Boston University, December 1954. I don't know how many people have old copies from the 1950s of the Graduate Journal of Boston University, but I don't imagine it's a very common thing around. But that said, that was an isolated place, and he just dashed off a quick, hasty little story for that, and there it went. I don't know if it came with any artwork or not. I'm willing to believe that probably there are no textual changes, however, between that and its appearance here, as there also appear to be no textual differences between its appearance here and its appearance in now the Easy to Find by Jupiter. So it's a fairly common little story, I guess, because of by Jupiter. But its inclusion here is a bit of a fun story in its own right. You see, this particular volume is one of those Gnome Press, gathered together by our old friend Martin Greenberg, the original one, not the one he worked with later on. And there's kind of a nifty little story about that. See, Martin Greenberg, of course, had been very instrumental in finally bringing Asimov's robot stories and his Foundation stories to book form. He needed a publisher. And at the beginning, he really liked, working with it, because here was somebody who's, taking his inputs and really turning them into publishable books that were themselves really nicely printed volumes, and beautiful covers, and pretty well typeset and everything like that. So, but that relationship had soured, as we know. I mean, the first one he did was the iRobot, where 9 stories were gathered together, and Asimov didn't mind tweaking every one of them to varying extents to kind of make them all fit together and remove some of the more extreme pulpishness from some of the earlier stories to try to turn it into a more or less cohesive book. Plus, he wrote some framing story involving Susan Calvin. So all of that was new material, together with the 9 existing stories, but as modified to fit together more smoothly. Powell and Donovan in particular went from merely people who were basically doing the same job as Susan Calvin to becoming a kind of field test engineer. So she's at the central area where they're doing the stuff to begin with, then they take it out to the field, and these 2 guys are involved with making it work on site and solving problems there. So, which was a nice division of labor, and it fit pretty smoothly with the way they had been in the stories, a lucky accident. Well, he did a lot for that one. He also did a fair amount for the first of the Foundation volumes. Again, there were 4 stories that had already been written. He writes a new one, the Psychohistorians, whole story segment, to replace a short section that he deletes from from the next one, simply called the Foundation, or as appears in our books, the Encyclopedists. He does a number of other tweaks throughout the volume. Another most notable one would be the reversal of the order between the big and the little, which became the merchant princes, and the wedge, which became the traders. And now they inverted their order, so you have the traders, then the merchant princes, plus the traders now as a new protagonist, no longer the Lathandivers that we would see in yet the next one, Dead Hand, or the General, the first part of the second volume, Foundation and Empire, but instead a newly introduced limmer poignets, was basically the Latin with a few other minor modifications to make it fit sequentially better in advance of Hober Mallow rather than its original following Hober Mallow. So there's changes for that. Another major change that he was willing to do was to introduce the Encyclopedia Galactica and intersperse some of its little quotes all along through the book. Well, as we get to the second and third Foundation volumes, you start seeing he does a whole lot less. A few very minor textual tweaks here and there, the insertion of the Galactic Encyclopedia Galactica, and with that the corresponding elimination of our historian essayist Liger and Vurer, are the main things that happen throughout those volumes. But even so, he's preparing all this material that at least is new to book form for these Gnome Press publications. But what happened was Asimov then was sitting with Martin Greenberg over lunch sometime after maybe in 1955 or 6, somewhere in there, and he was still writing books for Doubleday. I mean, we're getting The Caves of Steel, we're getting The End of Eternity, plus his collection of short stories, The Martian Way, and other stories. And Greenberg's been playing, wait a minute, you haven't written anything for me lately. That was our deal. You do one for them and one for me. It'd been kind of how it worked out the first few years, Pebble in the Sky and I, Robot in 1950. And then again, Foundation and The Stars Like Dust in 1951. And then again, Foundation and Empire on the one hand, and The Currents of Space in 1952. And so forth. And again, even Second Foundation, and I guess this would be where the Caves of Steel was coming in, although strictly that comes out in book form in 1954, though it got serialized in 1953. So, and we also got some Lucky Star stories, books coming along as well. So he's doing all this stuff for Doubleday, but he hasn't done anything more for Martin. Martin goes, why aren't you doing stuff for me? And then Asimov points out, well, you don't give me any up-to-date, you don't even give me reports of what your sales are, let alone pay out the royalties that I've earned. Because that was Martin Greenberg's main problem. He didn't like to pay royalties. So he just said, I'm not going to do that. In fact, eventually he would get this stuff from him, let these stories away from him, and then Doubleday could finally publish I, Robot and the Foundation Trilogy and do its own sub-leasing to various other paperback companies. So, but there is another follow-on to that. So he's no longer writing any more original material for Marty Greenberg. But the original 4 volumes that he had done with him were a nice volume. It's great to have them out there in book form. And eventually he would be in a position to cash in on that as well, but that was still years in the future. So he basically stayed pretty friendly with Martin Greenberg, which is probably more friendly, I would have to say, than it was probably for many of the other science fiction authors whose works didn't get so. Well, what happened here is that, as I said, he had written the story for the Graduate Journal of Boston University. It was like a little throwaway piece. But he hadn't been paid. It was just a donation. He just took a few minutes, typed the thing up, handed it off to him. Well, Marty Greenberg, their friends, he decides, wants something from him, anything. And so he's not going to write something. But here's this thing. It hadn't profited him in any way, and it already existed. He says, well, tell you what, I'll just hand you this and you can use it in your book. And it was the story, Let's Not. So, well, at least he got something. He didn't include it strictly as a story, but it's one of 2 introductions, the other being by Robert Heinlein. Brief mention of that we'll get to shortly. But he tells the story and he recounts it here in By Jupiter. It goes like this. Some people accuse me of getting every last bit of mileage out of everything I write. It's not a deliberate policy of mine, actually, but I must admit the mileage does seem to mount up. Even as long ago as 1954, it was happening. I had written Let's Not for my school, and, of course, I was not paid for it and didn't expect to be. Shortly thereafter, though, Martin Greenberg of Gnome Press asked me for an introduction for a new anthology he was planning, all about the future, which was slated for publication in 1955. I did not really like to refuse because I liked Martin Greenberg, even though he was years behind in his royalty payments. On the other hand, I did not wish to reward him with more material, so I compromised. How about a little story instead, I said, and I offered him Let's Not. He ran it as one of the introductions. The other, more conventional, was by Robert Heinlein, and wonder, he even got paid $10 for it. A little bit of royalty almost. So, actually then they paid for it after all. So, but it wasn't written, you see, for Martin Greenberg. It was just something he'd already had and written elsewhere. It already existed, and he just said, here you go, you're free to use it. And that's it. And Martin comes back with, very well, here's $10. That at least was a well done deal. But he was still not doing very well paying his royalties, if at all much. So, well, that's how that went. So, what is the story of Let's Not? Well, let me just. The other introduction of sorts is by Robert Heinlein, and there's a couple of quotes in here that I find he's making these predictions for the future. Now, this isn't too bad here. It says, it's number 11 on page 20 here, and it reads, your personal telephone will be small enough to carry in your handbag. Well, not bad. Actually, even your pocket, but okay. Your house telephone will record messages, answer simple queries, and transmit vision. Well, not bad, but no, okay. Let's compare that against the reality. Your personal phone transmits vision, not the other way around. Both can record messages, and neither of them answer simple queries. So, there you go. And it's small enough, and your personal will fit, like I said, in your pocket if you like. You know? And do a lot more than just be a telephone, one might add. Well, okay. Now, the other one that was a little bit more interesting, and this is actually kind of relevant to things today, and this is very serious. Okay. He said, the greatest crisis facing us, he's writing this in 1950, mid-50s, Robert Heinlein's writing, the greatest crisis is not Russia, not the atom bomb, not corruption in government, not encroaching hunger, nor the morals of the young. It is a crisis in the organization and accessibility of human knowledge. We own an enormous encyclopedia which isn't even arranged alphabetically. Our file cards are spilled on the floor, nor were they ever in order. The answers we want may be buried somewhere in the heap, but it might take a lifetime to locate two already known facts, place them side by side, and derive a third fact, the one we urgently need. And yes, information, fortunately, is a lot better indexed than one might have originally expected in those days. But at the same time, it's become a whole lot less trustworthy. We all know about fake news and so forth. Well, let's turn to the subject at hand. Let's not. It's a very short story, and really, it's little more than a conversation between actually, in this context of the story, the only two remaining university professors, one in chemistry and one in physics. And they have between them now only one lone graduate student, though there are other younger students who hopefully and presumably will also mature into being more graduate students. For a tiny community of maybe about 100 people living half a mile beneath the surface of the planet. And it's a cautionary tale. The idea being is the title is pretty much says it all. Let's not really means let's not blow ourselves up. I mean, we might be ready to go nuclear, but that's not a good idea. Not that I think we can go as far as disarming, especially when others are armed that that way, unfortunately. But at least you have a symmetry, and it's like the idea was, those really are the weapons too dreadful to use. Because we all saw what happened when they did get used back at World War II, and even whatever benefits you could say in ending the war promptly, it was still an unbelievable devastation, and really is way above and beyond what any war should ever have done. And it passed way out of the realm of just war. Just war, one thing, does not attack civilians. The soldiers meet on battlefield. They fight there. You see, the wives and children are home. They're safe. They're not disturbed. Their only danger is that their side or the other may lose, and then the soldiers of that side will come in and, you're lucky, or you may be kept alive as a slave or as a concubine, and if you're unlucky, they may just decide to kill you and take everything you own. That's where you're threatened. But the battle itself is removed from that. That it's not that way anymore, and basically the nuclear bomb of World War II is the beginning of that trend. And so these professors, they have this conversation. You can see that the idea is the ultimate nuclear disaster has happened, and now humanity is reduced to this little tiny underground enclave of a few hundred people who are hoping that after maybe 1,000 years or something, the radiation will die down enough that we might be able to consider going back up to the surface. And it's even more dire than that for reasons I will not spoil. So, which he managed to convey in an astonishingly short amount of space. But I won't spoil that. You have to read the story, which is in By Jupiter and therefore easy to find. So, what about all this nuclear war? We face all of that now. And our situation today makes me think of something I saw from, of all things, a Disney sequel movie. We all remember the Pocahontas movie. Yeah, not a very realistic portrayal of the American Indians, though I personally think it does have a very real charm to it, but it's very largely fictionalized to a very significant degree, despite its attempt to portray what would be seriously historical events. That said, however, it is the sequel to that, Pocahontas 2, I think, wherein we see what happens next. She sails to England. She meets up with this guy named Rolfe. So John Smith, we see him briefly, but he's all off to sail the world and adventure the world. He's seen America, and now he's ready to look at something else. Pocahontas is interested in her homeland, and because of how she's going and wanting to relate with, at the time, England is still in charge, she's wanting to be England, the colonizers of her homeland. No place else is of any interest to her. So, but she goes there, and Rolfe is an Englishman, and apparently certainly in the movie, and maybe real life, I think, basically a very honorable and upright man. So, she marries Rolfe, and they're going to be living happily ever after, I guess. Well, she doesn't live long for health reasons, but that's separate. In real life, we don't see that in the Disney movie. But there's an episode in there of particular relevance, I think, right now. There's a scene where this is an amusement that apparently existed back in several centuries ago and more, where you would take a bear or some other large animal, like say an elephant, but bears were most popular. You would chain it down so its movements are extremely restricted, and then you have a few guys with these sticks, and they poke at the bear to try to make it as angry as possible. And the bear gets furious and angry and, rages against its, whatever holds it in place, but it can't do anything. And you've got these guys, he, watch him get mad, he, like this very disgusting thing. And obviously, we are now in an era where, if nothing else, we don't do that anymore. That's over with, thank goodness. I think there are some real improvements, and that's definitely one of them. But that said, this is what they would do in those days. Well, that's poking the bear, okay? With those same people poking the bear, knowing the bear can't do anything to them at all, be the same if that bear were not confined. If that bear could fight back. They would, oh, absolutely not. I mean, that bear would maul a lot of them, and with every good reason and justification. So, that would be totally different. Now we're in a situation where we have Americans who we're not really capable bear hunters right now. We're just not. And that's all there is to it. I'm sorry to say it, but that's what we are. We are not capable bear hunters. But we are very skilled at poking the bear as if we think it's trapped. And it's just a marvelous Herculean self-control that the bear doesn't come and maul us. Because we are in no shape to defend ourselves anymore. How much so? Well, back in World War II, we really were. We were on top of the world, and in all the very best sense of the word. But even World War II, we had a saying that was so key to it all. Loose lips sink ships. You'd see posters of that everywhere. Even kiddie cartoons where the soldier writes a letter to his girlfriend back home with all this, well, we're going to go to the island of such and such, and we're going to take it over, we're going to do this and that, and we're going to, on October the 5th, and that, we're going to have all these, these detailed plans. So I hope all things go well on the home front, and, loves and kisses, And you see somebody intervene, the Japanese at that time, intercepting this message and being ready for us. Loose lips sink ships and cause a lot of death. Well, now, you know what? Nobody worries about that anymore. Because at the topmost level, we got a general who calls, Xi or Putin or whoever says, oh, by the way, we are planning to bomb the following 6 cities, and we've got our troops going here and there and there and there, and they're staged to attack on this date. Just thought I'd let you know. Yes, General Milley, I'm looking at you. That there's a word for that. Traitor. Man, I mean, Benedict Arnold got nothing on this guy in terms of just sheer betrayal. Well, sorry, I had to make a bit of a political commentary, but I'm grateful that Ukraine is able to defend itself as well as they have been, and so forth. But I'm also grateful to the extent that at least so far we've tried to stay out of it, except we are poking the bear, and I'm grateful that they haven't decided to maul us. And there it lies. Anyway, that's my commentary. Let's not blow ourselves up. Let's not. Thanks for listening.